I want to welcome everybody to this Congress dedicated to Father Guerra, this May. Theology, Translation and Interpretation, the Work and Legacy of Father Joaquim Guerra. I want to thank Professor Victoria Harrison again, and our very efficient Maggie secretary. And I must say I'm very sorry that I had all this funding in Portuguese this month, and my colleagues in at the University of Macau at our department could not participate. So I'm very sorry for that. But that's much better. That's Professor Pfister, right? So so that's okay, I think. Yeah. And so I want to do a brief presentation. Professor Pfister is a professor emeritus of the Hong Kong Baptist University and director of the Hefziba Mountain Aster Academy. Sorry about the pronunciation. And he published a great number of articles and books on Chinese philosophy and history of sinology. And what is very special and interesting for us, he is a specialist uh, in the topic of missionary scholars. So he wrote about Legge, James Legge, Serafin Couvret, uh, Richard Wilhelm, Joaquim Guerra, of course. He wrote about Guerra in English. That's beautiful. And Ernest Faber, Leon Viegger, and recently Solomon Cesar Malan. So, so it's a huge pleasure to have you here, Professor Pfister. Xixi, thank you. Just one or two words em português. O professor Pfister era
Yes.
professor aposentado da Universidade Batista de Hong Kong. Ele publicou uma série de artigos. Eu sou um fã da sua obra e o que é muito interessante para a gente, ele é um especialista nos sinologistas missionários, entre outras coisas, é claro, mas ele escreveu muito sobre James Legge e o Serafim Couvret e diversos outros missionários, Ernest Faber, Wilhelm, do I Ching famoso, aquele Wilhelm, o Leon Viegger, e recentemente ele editou um livro sobre o Salomão César Malan. Esse é novo, eu não conhecia. E ele publicou sobre o Padre Guerra em inglês e chinês. So it's a great honor. Thank you very much, Professor Pfister. The microphone
Thank
is
you.
yours.
Yes. And Pedro, are you able to help me with the PPT? Can you put that up and share screen? And I will follow what is there. Thank you. I'm so very sorry to you all that I had these technical problems. Living in the mountains has other problems to it, and today we started with snow, and so it had other impacts. I will go rapidly. Please move forward. And I was going to play with I wish I could have heard Professor Menenses and to understand more, but I was going to play punningly about guerra. My first foreign language was Spanish, and so guerra always meant war for me. And guerra also in Portuguese means that, and I know that Professor Zhang Minfeng has played with that somewhat, so I will not pursue the punning anymore. I actually created a new name for him, thinking of his friendship and his love for China. But what I'll do is move directly into the interpretive wars. You can see here that I created a name for him, Chong Kong, rather than the Zhendong. I thought maybe that might reflect more about his posthumous reality in his concern for raising up Master Kong. But I want to give a critical reflection about his work in the light of the history of various Jesuit traditions and where he aligned himself. So could we go to the next slide, there's a play I have with, there's three angels that are ending up getting messed up in the context of Jesuit addressing Ruist traditions. I will use Ruist for Confucian. The early Jesuit mission with Matteo Ricci and with his very seminal work, Qianzhu Shiyi, or The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, set the stage for what many others have already been able to deal with, and particularly Thierry Maynard, whose work I'm going to refer to later in this lecture. He had clearly worked out the connection between Zhang Zhuzheng, who was the imperial tutor to the Wanli emperor, and had left a set of what we could say straightforward commentaries to the four books, and these were employed by Jesuits of the early Jesuit mission to ultimately produce this work in 1687, Confucius Sonarum Philosophus, all in Latin, but also deeply influenced by Zhang Zhuzheng and his what in Chinese we call Banru Banfa, or half Ruist, half Confucian, and half authoritarian interpretations that happen to match up with what early Jesuit missionaries had in their minds with the ways the world could be reordered and properly just. As many of you know, the Jesuits were then disbanded, partly due to their positions on the nature of Master Kong and the status of Master Kong. And it was that position that became devastating for them. So that from 1773 until the second decade of the 19th century, the Jesuit order didn't officially exist. And when it was restored, it had to realign itself with many other orders in China that had already taken over some of their ministries. In the effort to try to readjust, there was a major shift between the Ming and Qing periods with regard to how people should consider the Ru traditions. And with the Manchurian-led Qing dynasty, the intellectual traditions received a very strong and directive ideological emphasis that said Zhu Xi's rationalist Li Xue traditions and their interpretations of the four books would become the standard. That was something that didn't exist during the Ming, and this shifted the whole discussion in the 19th century to a whole new level of concern about how do we properly interpret the Ru classics and the Ru traditions. Among those who remained faithful to the early Jesuit traditions was the Italian Jesuits who lived in the Shujiahui area, not yet at that time completely embraced by Shanghai. This person, Angelo Sotoli or Chao Deli, had continued to work in his massive 5-volume set that was a Chinese Latin bilingual text on Cursus Literaturae Sinacae. He presented the early Jesuit attitudes about, first of all, that Qian and Shangdi were equivalent to the concept of God, and used these translations generally in his work. Also, he referred to the Shengren in Chinese as a sanctus, as a saint. This had been done previously by Ricci and others, and especially those in Confucius Sonarum Philosophus, Philip Couplet and the other three that did that translation in Latin. But by the end of the 19th century, in 1895, the French Jesuit who lived in Hubei province, Seraphine Couvreur in Hejianfu, he offered a modern alternative to these interpretations. He used Jushi's interpretations, but then he translated the term shengren with the equivalent in French and in Latin of sage rather than saint, and became more self-conscious about critiquing the early Jesuit concerns and presentation of Confucius as a kind of pagan saint. Let us go to the next slide, please. This set the conditions for the interpretive wars. And here we find Guerra's claim in his, and please pardon me, I have no Portuguese experience and I cannot speak your language well. And so please critique me well at every point, not only in my pronunciation, but also in my efforts to understand his works. In the Quadrivolume de Confucio, Guerra presented Confucius not only as a prophet, but far more consistently. In fact, the word prophet, as far as I can see in his Quadrivolume, never occurs outside of the introduction. In the translation, Confucius is always un santo, a saint. And it is with a capital S. It's not a small s, it is emphatically so. And the only time where he could have perhaps used the term prophet would be in the Zhongyong, or in English, I'll use James Legg's later translation, The State of Equilibrium and Harmony. In chapter 24, it does say that a sage is able to pre-sage, to pre-understand, to anticipate things. But even in that context, Guerra did not use the word prophet. For him, Master Kong was always a saint, a sanctus, un santo. And so in his commentarial notes to Acts, Analects 9:6, what he called the interactions, I don't remember the Portuguese. You see the statement here, using his unique transliteration system. Legg translated sheng as sage, but he preferred to use the term saint, and he retained the word sage for translating the term xian. I've added the Chinese to his Portuguese texts there. We're not told by Guerra why he's rendering his preferable to Legg's, except that he would argue that the character xian is more appropriately rendered as sage. Notably, no one in any other foreign language rendering of the text manifests that they agree with Guerra, except for Angelo Zottoli, the Italian Jesuit I already introduced, who had produced his Latin renderings in 1879 to 1882. Legg renders xian as worthy or worthies, but Guerra prefers sabios. And you can see that Mr. Cabral has already sent you, I hope, as I saw, the comparative charts of the Chinese, of Guerra's Portuguese, and of Legg's English. And you can see this in the second book of the Mencius. As would be expected, Zottoli refers to xian as sapientes, agreeing with Guerra, but Couvreur renders it as, in French, one who has these unique virtues, but is not a saint or a sage even, xian. Notably, the Cihai dictionary, which was published just at the beginning of the time that Guerra was starting to produce his Portuguese renderings, it contrasts shengren from xian by referring to xian as a moral and wise person of highest caliber, 道德智能极高的人. While the latter, that is a xian, is talented with good moral behavior, 才能德行好. So the contrast in contemporary Chinese major dictionaries, even at that time, would have opposed Guerra's rendering of shengren as saint. It has something to do with moral and intelligence, morality and intelligence, but it is not saintly. And here's where the problematic arises. Next slide, please. What I'm hoping is here we can see how the interpretive wars are addressed by others. Now, Legge, being a Protestant missionary from the London Missionary Society, became very self-conscious of this, and he published specifically why he preferred the term sage or shengran to render it rather than saint. This comes from a footnote to the old text of the Zhongyong, the text that is found in the Li Ji that had not been reorganized by Zhu Xi. And he says there specifically, and here I read this text and then I'm going to elaborate on it. This was produced in 1885. Shengran, Remusat, Zotli, and Mini give for this name Sanctus Vir, un saint, the holy man. I prefer, after all, to adhere to the rendering le sage, the sage. The sage is an ideal man, is the ideal man. The saint is the man sanctified by the Spirit of God. Humanity predominates in the former concept, divinity in the latter. The ideas of morality and goodness belong to both names. See Mencius 7:9-25 for his graduation of the appellations of good men. Now here I want to clarify what may not be clear to some of you. There is an error when he says Mencius 7:9, he meant 7:2 or 7b, we would say 25, and a printing error that was very unfortunate. But to explain conceptually and historically what Legge is claiming, first, Remusat is Jean-Pierre Abel Remusat, the French academician who was a major sinologist and often followed the Jesuits very clearly, especially with the Tao Te Ching, was concerned about the possibility of the name of Yahweh in the Tao Te Ching, and he promoted this, among other statements of the Jesuit figurists of the early Jesuit mission. But he says Remusat, Angelo Zotli, and Mini give, they render the name Shengran, Sanctus Vir, a saint. Who are the other many? These included those 4 Jesuits who in 1687 produced Confucius in Arm Philosophus. They regularly referred to, in Latin, to Master Kong as saint. What Legge means by name now in 21st century English, we would refer to as a concept or a general term. So he's saying this general term, Shengran, is rendered in such and such a way. And for the early Jesuits in particular, and a good number of them, including Francois Noël, among those I've already mentioned, they referred to Master Kong as a saint in their own languages, whether Latin or French in particular. What the meaning of the phrase sanctified by the Spirit of God includes is absolutely central here, because what he's saying is the sage as an ideal man is a person who achieves this status by means of their own moral and intellectual abilities. But a saint is a person who is granted this unique status by the power of the Spirit of God. And is that clear from the texts of the Analects? That becomes the issue. The next slide, please. This is where the interpretive wars become thick. So here is the passage that James Legge referred to. It's a very famous passage, and I'll go through it rather quickly. But what I've done is to show that the 6 stages of moral, what we could say, whole person cultivation, moving from what is shan and xin, or what could be seen as good and faithful. Those would be possible renderings. They're described and they are extended all the way up to, interestingly, what is a sheng ren, in Legg's word, sage, in Zotoli and in Guerra, sanctus, and then ultimately beyond that, shen, which can be used even in certain Protestant contexts as God. And so it's a remarkable statement. But in the context of Mencius, it does not have that meaning. Let's go to the third slide from this. I move carefully by comparing Legge, Zotoli, Couvreur, and Guerra. And the next one, please. We will see the final statements here, how they are rendered. Yes, thank you. So Sheng is a sage in Legg's rendering, Sanctus in Zotoli's rendering, Sage par excellence, or Summe sapiens in Couvreur. So he's following more along Legg's modern side, modern characterization, but it is Santo once more in Guerra. Guerra and Zotoli remain partners in this translation tradition that started with the early Jesuits and continues on. But what's intriguing in this statement by the Master Meng, or Mencius, or Mengzi, we could use all these references, is that we don't have any reference to Qian or to Shangdi, to the deity. The matters of how a person who is Sheng comes into being is that they have already attained a greatness that is transformed, but it doesn't say how it's transformed and by what means it's transformed. And this is critical for being able to ask, is Master Kong sanctified by the Spirit of God? We don't see anything here, and that clarifies that. It would have to be read into the interpretation of the passages that describe these states of being. And even the term Shen, Legge uses a very awkward phrase, spirit man, but Zotoli has spiritualis, which is at this point somewhat similar to Couvreur in spirituel and spiritualis, the same word. But here we have Guerra making a farther step. Shen for him is a person who has das almas e dos espíritus. And he is, with the capitalization of almas and espíritus, he's saying the spirits of the blessed saints and this Holy Spirit. He doesn't say holy here, but the Spirit himself is involved. So Guerra, by translation, is making a claim that Master Meng is actually supporting a vision of a sagely or a intelligent and saintly person as being equivalent to, or at least guided by, the Holy Spirit. A radical change in terms of this translation of this passage that Legge says is only moral. Let us proceed. This sets the stage for the interpretive wars. Confucius is both a prophet and a saint to Guerra. The next stage we have here is how Guerra approaches, Confucianism itself. Is he just a traditionalist? Is he just saying everything that has happened in the past is what is saintly and needs to be taken without any critical negative position? No, Guerra is not merely a traditionalist. I say this because in my English article of 2015, I referred to him a good number of times with this term as a critical. It was a critical statement, but I'm revising that now. He was at times, I would call it from the Hermeneutics translation, he was domesticating Rua's teachings to his own preferred Roman Catholic worldview, and I will illustrate this in a moment. But this is something that a Ruist traditionalist would not do. A Ruist traditionalist emphasizes the status and the unquestionable status of all the canonical texts. Guerra is not merely doing that. He is trying to align those texts with his own preferred Roman Catholic worldview. And in this, there's good reasons to be critically concerned. The fact that Guerra accepted Ruist canonical texts, which contain quotations from Confucius that are found nowhere else, nor in even the early compilation of the Analects, is an interpretive perspective that would be traditionalist and uncritical. And that's where I first initially in 2015 began to be concerned about what he was arguing, particularly in the Dasha, in the Zhongyong. He has no question that any of the statements that are there, and some of them appear only in these two works and are not found in earlier collections like the Analects of Master Kong, he just assumes that they are originally true. Now, that's a side to his works that are traditionalist, but the most important concerns arrive in how he reads into his texts in certain passages, and I will refer here to the Mengzi, the Mencius, books 5, or what he called Mancio, I don't know how to pronounce it again, but books 5 and 7, but most significantly, the Xiaojing, chapter 16. And so, if you would, Mr. Cabral, please move to the Xiaojing. That passage will be most important for us to look at. In the Mengzi, we've already looked at the statements that occur, and let's continue on to the next one. These I have sent to you so you could compare. It's intriguing to me, yes, that when Guerra refers to the saintliness of Master Kong, he reads into the text. When it says that he has strength, he says it is divine strength. He is making as much effort as possible to indicate how Master Kong is truly not just a prophet, but a saint. And here, in comparison with Leg, we find there are variances in the ways things are rendered. I have given you in the comparative charts the Chinese original, which would help too. But for Guerra to say that the ancient sagely kings were serving not only God, but also their manes, their spirits, other spirits, that he was concerned about what Leg calls spiritual intelligences, shenming. But here again, Guerra says they are the manes and the world of the vivos, both the world of those who have passed away and the world of those who are alive. This is not in the Chinese original text. It's very hard to figure out where he comes to render the shenming in this way, unless he has, his own preconcerns, or prejudgments hermeneutically. Particularly near the end of this section of the 16th chapter of the Xiaojing, he refers to how in the ancestral temple, or no parental, the spirits of the departed, he refers to as das benditas almas. Now, I assume that this is actually a Roman Catholic phrase for blessed saints, blessed souls, those that have received special blessing and special sanctification from the divine. And once more, when he refers to the shenming, not only as spiritual intelligence, but as those who have died and those who are continuing to live. Here, I find a most remarkable effort to try to bring consistency between this very important chapter in the Xiaojing, on filial piety and its virtues with a Roman Catholic vision of the saints, the blessed souls, and those who both living and dead who are under the sovereign guidance of the Holy God. Is that within the Chinese text? I have my reservations. Let us go to the next slide, please. Beyond the interpretive wars and the efforts of the early and modern Jesuits, we have others who were influenced also by the Second Vatican II, okay? Guerra had characterized these persons of Ru standing as sagely and even saints, and particularly emphasized Master Kung as a Ruist saint, as a Confucian saint. Here I want to refer to another Jesuit, Thierry Maynard, who has spent a long time in the southeastern part of China, in the Guangdong province, teaching in universities, and now has been very active also in Beijing at a Jesuit center there. When he deals with the rendering in 1687 of the early Jesuits taking the Analects into Latin, and he cites their claim, putting it into English: heaven has made our teacher to become a saint. This sounds like sanctification. This sounds like a sanctification. If heaven is equivalent somehow to the Spirit of God, then it would seem justified from the Chinese text itself that there is something to be said here for rendering the term Shengren as sanctus. But Maynard has this critical statement, and this is published also in 2015. In Europe of the late 17th century, the claim that Shengren is sanctus was problematic. The claim that Shengren is santo, or dos santos. First, it suggested that Jesuit missionaries had, on their own initiative and without the approval of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, canonized Confucius. Pardon me for the three there. I don't know where it came from. Second, and misspelled, it suggested that someone like Confucius, outside biblical history in the church, could be chosen by God. That even James Legge would agree. Legge also referred to Confucius as a prophet in 1877. But the first one, especially for Roman Catholic concerns about the approval of ecclesiastical hierarchy, is very significant. Thirdly, and finally, it suggested that not only could Chinese Christians pay respect to Confucius, but also even pray to him as an intercessor to God, just as Europeans prayed to their own saints. And here he, of course, is referring to primarily Roman Catholic Europeans, maybe to Anglicans, but at the time, I think he was thinking specifically of European Roman Catholics. In the theological context of that time, the 17th century, the claim was highly controversial, and in fact was condemned by the Sorbonne in 1700 and by Pope Clement the 11th in 1704. Now, Maynard, as a Jesuit, is raising these questions. To refer to Master Kung as a saint is to challenge the very nature of the religious authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And yet, this is something that in a post-Vatican II context could be made possible. It was argued that in Vatican II, Roman Catholicism had, we could say, using Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's theological concept, the Roman Catholic Church offered the omega point of religious and spiritual insight that came from special revelation. But many others had been given general revelation revelation. They had started maybe with an alpha and moved through the beta and the lambda, ultimately and they could be headed toward the omega. This was part of a post-Vatican II hermeneutic that Guerra was applying with great vigor to argue that Master Kong, Confucius, was in fact a saint, and a saint that was sanctified by the Holy God, at least confirmed, made into a saint. The next slide, please. These are setting the stage for the interpretive wars. There are more than one post-Vatican II perspective that could be used to look at Master Kong. We've seen now that though Guerra's strong position is that Confucius is a saint, is challenged by Thierry Maynard, a Jesuit himself as well, from France. But also we have then a seminal work, Christianity and Chinese Religions, produced in 1989, just as Guerra was finishing his Portuguese canonical works now on the Wu traditions. You have a work by Julia Qing and Hans Kuhn, both of whom would align themselves with a post-Vatican II vision of how to look at other religious traditions, and they offer an alternative to Guerra's account of Master Kong. Next slide, please. I raise this to indicate that there's a plural.
Hi, Professor Pfister. I think we are having technical difficulties.
Okay.
Oh, you are back. Here you
okay,
are.
Good.
Go on.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm sorry. It can happen from the mountains. This is why I was trying to get to another place and failed. I am presenting to you then here through the voice of Julia Qing, who died in 2001. Good, I'm glad you can hear. And also for Hans Kuhn, who just passed away last year at a ripe old age of 90. Both of them being post-Vatican II Roman Catholic intellectuals addressed in their book, Christianity and Chinese Religion, the status of Confucius. Look at what they say. Julia Qing presents Confucius on the basis of his famous autobiographical statement in Analects 2:4 that he at 50 had come to know Tianming as a religious man, a believer in heaven, as personal God, a man who sought to understand and follow heaven's will. So that sounds very strong. And it was in its own day quite remarkable. In 2003, you begin to have a movement that reasserts the religious significance of Wu traditions, of Confucian traditions. But this was 2 years before this. Julia Qing is saying this about Master Kong. He's a religious man, a believer in heaven. And that's a strong statement from a post-Vatican II position. But listen more to what she says. In the past, the 5 classics have been attributed to Confucius, and he was thought to be either their editor or, especially in the case of the Spring and Autumn Annals, the Tunqiu, a direct author. Contemporary scholarship no longer takes this seriously. Now, it was certainly taken seriously by Guerra. So here a contrast between Julia Qing and Guerra exists. Like Guerra, her accounts of Mencius, Mengzi, and Xunzi revealed that the former had a strong belief in heaven, but one that was more imminent and is present in man's heart. Mengzi continues to hold in extreme the practice of offering sacrifices to the Lord on high and to ancestors. So he's affirming these exist, and Mengzi wanted that practice, but Xunzi took it to be superstitious. And so here you see how Guerra considered Xunzi, Master Xun, as the first heretic of Ruist traditions, as he referred to him, and Juxi was the second. Qing is aware of the differences and the rationalist role, which she refers to as a humanist tradition, and she uses that to then summarize the philosophy of Juxi. But she doesn't go as far as Guerra in her statement in 1989. She shows Juxi to be complex and immensely influential, but in her final work of her life in 2001, she actually wrote on the religious thought of Juxi and claimed he was a theist, something that Guerra would reject. But his theism, his Ruist theism, was more, in her mind, like the process philosophy and its theological metaphysics promoted by Alfred North Whitehead. Here we have an alternative, and we could say quite charitable account of Juxi and Kongzi and Mengzi particularly, but it does not follow that these are all saints, or even Master Kong was a saint. Let us go to the next slide, please. Here we have the presentation of Hans Kuhn and his particular claims regarding Confucius in comparison to the person of Jesus. And so I find them particularly revealing. According to Kuhn, Jesus Christ was an impassioned messenger, and I'm quoting from his text here, and thus a guide for others in the Semitic prophet spirit. To many during his lifetime already he was the anointed, Messiah, Christ, pure. Master Kong, by contrast, was a man of sober reflection on ethics and politics, the comprehensively learned teacher, and thus a guide for others in the spirit of Far East humanistic wisdom. He only became influential long after his death. Kuhn clearly does not see Master Kong as a saint. He may be prophetic, and he's certainly a teacher, but he doesn't even use the term prophet here. And yet he is guided as well by a post-Vatican II hermeneutic, an openness to the religious sides. But he goes on to make further claims, and he does this here in contrast. Secondly, he says, Jesus Christ is sent by God, called men and women to conversion with a view to salvation from guilt and all evil in the kingdom of God. He asks people to do the will of God in practical service to their fellows. Master Kong, this is his way of referring, and my way too, of referring to Confucius, by contrast, listen to the voice of the ancients rather than divine revelation. Now, there's the first claim. Could he be a saint without divine revelation? Master Kong demanded the renewal of the outer constitution of the state, as well as the inner constitution of every individual. Both were to be done in reverence for the will of heaven. But how do you know the will of heaven if there's no divine revelation? Is it done by rational reflection? Is it done by moral attainment? Is there some special revelation that brings sanctification to Master Kong? Hans Kuhn doubts this. Thirdly, in his final comparison, Kuhn says, Jesus Christ proclaimed a personally involved love. This love, those knowing Koine Greek would say agape. This agape includes those who suffer and those who are oppressed, the sick and the guilty, but also the opponent, the enemy. It is a universal love. We could say a godly, sacrificial, and sensitive care, and an entirely active doing of the good. Master Kong, by contrast, wanted to strengthen the sense of human autonomy and responsibility through sober, rational reflection. Notice here again, Kung is not making any reference to Master Kong's belief in heaven, which could be challenged here, but he is adopting this position to say Master Kong is a different, a kind of third kind of figure between Ru, Buddhist and Christian figures. He is a rational, autonomous person. Human destiny was to be mastered in reverence for heaven, but without anxiety about ghosts and spirits. Another maybe alternative to the way Guerra handles the spirits. A harmonious relationship between human beings and nature was to be sought. All people were to be shown humanity, but Master Kong clearly states that if a person responds in anger, you are to deal with them in justice or straightforwardness, not in love. So here, what I'm presenting to you is an alternative post-Vatican II hermeneutic as it's applied to the person of Confucius and his status. Here we see both Julia Qing and Hans Küng, inspired by this new openness in Roman Catholic tradition, do not share the same vision that Guerra has, that Master Kong is in fact un santo. Next, please. The next slide. I have been arguing then that from a critical reflection on Guerra's position, we have a contrast between where he aligned himself to the early Jesuit traditions, and he made claims and even read into passages such as the Shaojing and the Mengzi, issues that sought to portray Confucius as being one who had been given divine power to be transformed into not merely a prophet, but a true saint, a saint outside of Roman Catholic ecclesiastical benedictions and their processes that would normally be given to a person after they have passed away. He was a living saint. He was one who showed the powers of heaven and the insights of the divine. Intriguingly, Thierry Maynard, Julia Qing, and Hans Küng, all of them as post-Vatican II Roman Catholic intellectuals disagree with Guerra. And it sends a message to me, at least, that it's possible then that in this great work, this effort of Guerra over a period in his beginning of his translations and the publication of them from 1979 to 1988, when he produced in Portuguese what would be called a canon in translation. As they were published, they became canon in their own right. They were standards that we use, and this is why it's right. And Mr. Cabral is just wonderful that this Congress could be here. Yet there are such significant in the realm of the Quadrivolume and the Mencius, the Mancio, there are such significant interpretive problems. I would suggest that for some of you who are far more competent than I am in Portuguese, and perhaps also more competent than I am in Chinese, that it is time for a new set of translations with new critical apparati, where a whole new range of 21st century Portuguese renderings of Ru classics could be done and could increase and advance beyond Guerra's noble, but I think ultimately flawed efforts at portraying Master Kong in his teachings and his status. I would offer that to you all as my final, concluding reflection, and hope that what I've said here, in spite of it being so late, I'm so very sorry, it has some insight and maybe some stimulus for your own work. Thank you so very much. We can end the sharing of the.
Thank you so much, Professor Pfister. I want very much to ask a question, so I think I'll okay. Andrew.
Please.
Go on. I'm sorry. Were you raising your hand or uploading?
No, but I actually I have question, but I haven't
yes.
raised my hand. But
I'm so
it seems like you can read my mind. Can I ask now? Oh, okay. Thank you,
Please.
Professor Pfister, for your presentation. I wonder how does Guerra understand the relationships among four books, Analyst, Menzies, Doctrine of the Mean, and also Great Learning? Because it seems that in your presentation, he tries to use Menzies' understanding of heaven, for example, to justify his argument that Confucius is the saint. But it assumes certain consistency among four books. And as I have realized, this consistency has been seriously challenged by modern interpreters and Chinese philosophers. So I wonder whether he assumes certain consistency when he makes this claim.
Yes, very good question and very important issue. There's an inconsistency in how Joaquim Guerra deals with the Dashui and the Zhongyong. He spends a very long time in his introduction to the Dashui to reject the new text of Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi reordered and reorganized and even added texts, especially the 5th chapter of the commentary of Dashui, and Guerra rejected it completely. The original order of the Dashui, as revealed in the old text of the Li Ji, is what he presents. Ironically, he should have done the same to the Zhongyong, because there are inconsistencies between the new text of the Zhongyong that Zhu Xi has, and also reordered not so thoroughly, but it has much higher claims about the status of the Shengran and so on in the Zhongyong than you have in the Dashui. It's very, very significant. Unusually, Guerra did not adopt the old text of the Zhongyong, and I don't know why. He should have been just as critical, because both of these are chapters in the Li Ji. They're 400 years after Master Kong has come into has been present and has died, and his influences are there. There are clearly claims made in those two texts that are claimed to be sayings of Master Kong that we find nowhere else, and there's no critical assessment of that. So in this way, Guerra is clearly adopting a position that would be something like a traditionalist, saying all of these must be true and we have to find a way of putting them together. He does it by making the claim that Master Kong is in fact a saint sanctified by heaven. What is unusual, and here I would assume, Mr. Tam, that you know, in the quadrivolume of the that's presented in Guerra, he does not take the Mangzio. He does not take the Mangzi. He uses Xiaojing. And Xiaojing is even later, a much later text. And it has a very different worldview that's tied to it. That's why I referred to particularly chapter 16 in it, where Guerra actually provides, he claims that the Guishan are, they're blessed souls. This is remarkable. It is not something that would be seen, and yet because the Xiaojing claims to be stated by Master Kong, half of it is sayings of Master Kong in response to questions by Zhengzi, the disciple Zhengzi. He assumes that yes, there is a consistency between all these texts that actually are produced 500, 600 years after Master Kong had passed away. So this is a critical problem, that Guerra, we could say hermeneutically, he refused to receive any statement that was in these texts that claimed to be the statements of Master Kong. He refused to see them as false or fabricated by later scholars. That is generally what Julia Ching also states clearly. That is generally the statement of contemporary scholars now of these texts. These are not the true sayings. All of them, are not the true sayings of Master Combe, and that opens a door for a new critical hermeneutic, a new angle to reinterpret these texts. I hope that helps you and
Thank you very
answers
much.
your question.
I need to ask one. Can you hear me,
Please.
Professor? Yes.
Yes.
I was very surprised. I read your PPT before, but I think I did not understood at first what you meant, and about the character Shan and the expression almas benditas. I wonder if this means simply for Guerra, if this means simply the departed. It seems that you suggested that this is maybe a saint in the, I don't know, the Catholic sense, someone who can intercess for other people. Is that the word? We can pray to them. They led holy lives, and my impression, I'm confused now, is that Guerra meant this as any departed, and this is a very strange notion, if I'm right, actually, in that, because if all dead people can be intercessors to God, this is very strange indeed. I don't think that's the original Catholic notion, but I'm a terrible Catholic. I'm not even a Catholic. I'm a Brazilian who is not a Catholic. But I adore Catholics. I love them. So does it make sense?
I would assume, yes, I would assume your Portuguese sensitivities are much better than mine, absolutely. And so if that phrase refers only to those who have passed on, it's a euphemism for those whose souls, these are those who have died and their souls are in the presence, I assume, the presence of the divine. It may not then refer to that which is then an intercessory soul or an intercessory saint. Here I bow to your sensitivity to that. I do not have the cultural or linguistic understanding to grasp precisely that phrase.
Well, I must say I'm not sure. I am not sure, really. It seems
Okay.
very strange notion. But well, Professor Moeller raised his hand. Professor Moeller.
Hans-Georg.
Yes, hi. Yes, thanks a lot for the presentation. Actually, I found this very interesting, and I was glad to see that you were presenting such a text critical view, which of course is not surprising given your own scholarly background. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say hello, Lauren. Good to see you. I couldn't make it for the last presentation that you gave to our department, to my regret, and so I just wanted to take this opportunity to for three things. Number one, to thank you for the very enlightening talk. Number two, for apologizing to have missed the previous one. And number three, just to say hello. Good to see you, Lauren.
Okay. What you say, though, Hans-Georg, you are a textual critical scholar as well, and your Tao Te Ching shows it very, very much. The Tao Te Ching that you offer is really informed by earlier texts, the Guodian and also the Ma Wang Dui, but the Guodian particularly. You do things that are new for 21st century scholarship in that text. And I believe that it is time for those of these many who are here who use Portuguese far better than I. It is time to go beyond Guerra. It can be done, and it can be done justified by both a more textually sensitive reading of these canonical works, as well as challenging the kind of post-Vatican II hermeneutic that I still would argue he still has, at least in the presentation of Confucius as santo, as a saint, is problematic. You know, it skews the text in ways that require rethinking and retranslation and reinterpretation. And I know that you and I at that level have spent quite a bit of our time trying to make sense of past renderings and to correct them, to give maybe new insights into what were these older Chinese textual traditions. And in that, I respect you much, and it's a delight to see your face again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Moeller. Nice to see your face. Anyone else? I have many. If you guys don't have one, can I ask another one? I'm sorry. I think we are. It's
Please,
10
no.
and 10.
It's very late for you all.
I'm
so sorry.
Well, if we can abuse you, we could finish now, of course. I wanted to ask another one about leg, but I can, of course, write an email, sure.
No, but please ask. Very
Yes.
seldom do we all have the opportunity to hear your questions.
I'm very, oh my God, what I did. Yes, it's about Leg's understanding of Sheng and a saint or as a sage. And I think he says that, in the case of in the case of a sage is more like an ideal man. I think it means more personal effort. And he says that a saint is sanctified by the Spirit of God. And then he says, humanity predominates in the former concept, divinity in the later. The ideas of morality and goodness belong to both names. If he says divinity predominates, it means that it's not just this. Is my English okay? I mean, maybe it's more divinity in the case of the saint, but there is also other aspects to it. And in the case of the sage, it's the same. Maybe it predominates the humanity part, but maybe there is just a bit of religiosity, I don't know. So I wonder if Leg was not trying to push too hard this point. He was trying to emphasize too much the lack of religiosity depth of Confucius, because arguably maybe, well, he's not a Christian saint, but maybe there was some religiosity. Maybe it's a difference in degree. But maybe, so I wonder if he was trying to push too hard this reading for pastoral concerns, like Guerra said. He was, in other words, he was trying too much to reduce Leg, and so people reduce Confucius, so people would go to Christ. Yes, so I suspect Leg thought that Confucius was not completely religious after reading your article. Maybe Leg thought Confucius had a bit of religiosity. That was the question. I hope it's clear.
Let me explore it with you. Leg, in his initial work on the Chinese classics in 1861, literally derided Master Kong. He considered Master Kong, Confucius, he says, he's not a great man. After I've looked at him, he's not a great man. His influence is waning and it will disappear. And by 1873, having completed his initial studies of the Chinese classics, he changed his position. And he began to respect the power of Ruist theism that was expressed in Master Kong's teachings and life, but was different. Because it was theistic, it was not at all Trinitarian to him. It was not at all an exact equivalent to what would be seen as a Christian metaphysics, but it would be the same as you would find perhaps in a theism that would be Jewish or Muslim, not the same traditions, not the same personages, but the concept of deity, of a high God was there. And here he was even self-consciously referring to Andrew Lang's later work on high God thesis from anthropological points of view. By 1877, Legge wrote a very well-known and controversial essay. He was in Oxford at the time. He'd already started his professorship in Oxford, and he wrote that Confucius truly was a prophet of God. He uses the phrase. So Guerra's reference to it, I do not see it, that he directly says, oh, Legge also did this. I didn't find it, but my Portuguese is terrible. So perhaps Mr. Cabral, you and others can help me discover this. But clearly, Legge states in 1877, he was a prophet of God. He was like those others. The prophets, the Hebrew prophets, had a theism that was not Trinitarian. They didn't necessarily at all, outside of maybe Isaiah, having some hint of a messianic alternative. Here we have something unique. And Legge became more and more concerned about supporting Confucius' religious theism. And so in his 1880 volume it's a series of lectures on Confucianism and Taoism in comparison to Christianity, he takes a significant amount of time to readdress various different aspects of Master Kong's life, his birth, his status, his beliefs. And he says, this is a man who's truly religious, who is inspired by heaven, but is inspired to work out justice on earth. And in this, there's a parallel with the Hebrew prophets, but he never goes so far as to say he is saintly. The one criticism that he had morally and ethically is the one that was laid out by Hans Küng. That is, where in the Tao Te Ching, in chapter 67, when it talks about the Sanbao, the three treasures, one of them is to live in compassion. Yeah, and Master Kong is willing not to be compassionate to people who are angry and ugly. Yeah. He wants justice and straightforwardness, but he does not speak of loving them openly. This is what Hans Küng repeats. He doesn't cite Legge. And I don't know if Küng had actually read Legge on this, but this was a criticism. Legge realized that in the Ruist theism that Master Kong promoted, there was an ethical restraint that would not be parallel to a Christian agape. So it is not without some critical reflection that Legge, asserted Master Kong's religious, attitudes and beliefs in his later life, but he did so with a critical awareness that there was something yet different between the Christian ethic of agape and the Confucian ethic of what would be yuan bao zhi, and not yuan bao de in Chinese. Okay, I hope that gives you some things to consider.
I have thousands of points here in my notes. Not thousands, I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. But I think we have to finish because it's a bit late.
Yes.
And I have to thank you so much, because so early in the Rockies. I think it's the Rockies. They call it Colorado Rockies. So
Yes.
early in the morning. Thank you so much for your participation. Obrigado, Professor Pfister.
Yes, and my deep apologies to all of you. I sincerely, I was up very, very early trying to get in connection, and we had a failure of our Ethernet connection, and so I'm profoundly sorry that it was delayed, and particularly to Professor Menezes. I am so very sorry to put him under that unusual pressure. Yeah. Not to mention Mr. Cabral. Yeah.
Oh, no problem at all. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Professor Pfister. I thank everybody. Obrigado, povo.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Yes.
People are applauding. Thank you, Professor Andrew. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Muller. Thank you. Pedro Sobral. Obrigado.
Obrigado.
Coitado do professor Pfister, pô. Caiu a internet dele. Esse é o lado ruim de morar nas montanhas, né? The mountains. That was my plan to move to the mountains. Yeah. I'll move to the mountains someday. Vai, professor Antônio, obrigado.
Our home is your home. Come. You know, it is a joy to be in the midst of such majestic places. Goodbye to all.
Bye.
Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor. Tchau. Tchau. Tchau, gente. Tchau. Professor. Na verdade, eu vou ficar aqui esperando as pessoas irem embora. Se alguém quiser conversar comigo. Então é isso aí. Tchau. Oh, Erasto. Grande Erasto, cara. Professor José Grande. É um prazer, Erasto. Obrigado por nos assistir. Aí, professor. Xixi. Thank you so much. Bye bye.